So before we get started with this video, I just want to give a shout out to two of our newest channel members. Thank you to Jasmine Nowak and Chris Prizzle. Thank you both for becoming channel members. And if any of you want to become a channel member, you can click the link in the description box below. Now let's get into the main video. Hello everybody, my name is Brady and we are back with another React video, and today we're going to be checking out more of the extra history series on Admiral Yi, which I've really enjoyed so far. I liked the first two, but I think I'm going into this one feeling more excited. The first one, I had no idea what to expect. The second one, that followed the first one, and that one was kind of circular. But once the Japanese got involved, my ears perked up a little bit. I got a little bit more excited. We're getting to action, and now we have Yi in a position where he's a little bit more stable. Not being screwed around with too much, not being thrown in and out of powerful positions. No, it seems like he's in a very secure position, which I think is going to make this a lot more interesting. We're going to really get into the action. He's already destroying right now. I'm just curious to how much further this is going to go now that he's been elevated. So let's get this video started.
The king had fled from Seoul. The court was making the arduous trek to Pyongyang. Half of Korea was already in Japanese hands. Yi Il, the very same man who had once tried to pass his negligence off to Yi Sun-shin, was the commander of the Korean army. His forces were routed in battle after battle. Essential fortifications and choke points were abandoned, surrendered with barely a fight. Then, in the Battle of Cheongju, the regular Korean forces, under the command of a man named Shin Rip, were annihilated. This is the moment that forces the king to abandon his capital. This is the moment that leads many to fear that Korea as a nation may not survive. But on the very same day that the king fled from his seat, Admiral Yi was destroying the Japanese fleet in Okpo Harbor. Hope for the nation lived in a handful of ships plying the coast.
This is really interesting because Yi, from what you guys tell me, has a purely naval reputation as far as like his grand legacy goes. You guys have compared him to, like, he said he's like the naval Alexander the Great, and I think that's a fantastic image that puts in my head. I'm curious to how he would be able to hold this up. There must be other elements in land warfare that end up holding up the army. One guy cannot win this whole thing once the Japanese have already taken that much land. So there must be other elements coming in, but it is really building this up as if he's completely alone here. So I don't know exactly what to expect.
For 3 weeks after Okpo, Yi gathered charts, scouted out the enemy fleet, and waited for his secret weapon, the turtle ship, to arrive. Then his spies reported to him that the Japanese were anchored at Sachun. This was too near his personal headquarters for comfort, so it was time he tested out the turtle ship. It was time he drove them off. But when his tiny fleet of 26 ships arrived outside Sachun, he saw that the Japanese arquebusiers had taken up positions along the cliffs above the harbor. If he were to attack, they could pour down fire on his ships. He pondered this for a moment. Then he sent a small detachment to sail within sight of the Japanese fleet. Once they were sure the Japanese had spotted them, they turned and fled, and the Japanese gave chase. But the retreat was feigned. As soon as the Japanese fleet entered open water, Yi fell upon them with his entire force. His turtle ship plowed into the middle of the Japanese armada. Cannon fire rang out from all sides. Ships splintered and burned in the setting sun. The Japanese...
Well, that's pretty clever, I guess. I mean, I guess it's not the most clever thing. I have so much trouble following military history, let alone naval history. But this seems like a fairly standard strategy. You send out a decoy, you lure them into the rest of your forces. Like I've seen plenty examples of stuff like this going on. I'm curious to see some of the... I think the use of the turtle ship, that's huge. That is absolutely huge, that being kind of his baby. I'm going to have to check out some actual pictures of this thing, because it looks fascinating. And I feel like I've seen it before, but I'm not completely sure. Let me pull something up. Oh, that's pretty cool. The picture does do it justice, I would say. It's really impressive, very strange, I would say. I guess, I don't know, there's something about Western history. I feel like we don't have the same kind of flash in the way that we design things that Eastern history has. I understand like so much of this is practical, but there is a particular style to this that is very unfamiliar to me. And I guess being overexposed to a lot of the Western stuff, this looks incredibly impressive to me. Like everything going on here, like that looks like it's straight out of like a video game or something. It's one of those things like it's hard to believe is real.
Japanese tried to close in, but they couldn't manage to board the covered turtle ship. With the Korean warships surrounding them and the turtle ship in their midst, the Japanese fought a hopeless battle until all 13 of the ships that had pursued the Koreans to open water were at the bottom of the sea. Not a single Korean vessel was lost. After the battle, as his commanders gathered for a debriefing, Yi loosed his coat, pulled out a sword, and dug out a bullet that had lodged in his shoulder. His sub-commanders were amazed. To maintain morale, Yi had let no one know that he'd been injured in the fight. But as they all sat dumbfounded, Yi simply began to brief them on what to do in case of a counterattack. The next day, local fishermen reported
That is quite beastly. One thing that you guys have told me, I've been checking the comments a little bit. I haven't been checking them as much as I used to, but I've been checking them a little bit on this series because I've had so many questions. You've told me that a lot of the stuff that the sources that went into this series are actually some of the less generous to him, which I think that's a really interesting thing to note here. I understand like maybe we're lacking the best information, but if you're leaning with some of the less complimentary stuff, you would assume he wouldn't be like this complete boss Chad dude that like cannot be beaten by anybody. You would think you would see some more flaws in his character, but thus far I've found nothing to dislike about this guy. I'm usually kind of like a glass half empty guy when it comes to historical figures. I like to really highlight what their mistakes are, what their flaws are, because that's what makes them more human. But honestly, I'm not seeing it with this guy. He seems pretty awesome.
Reported to Yi that the Japanese were anchored at Dongpo and that their men were sacking the city. Yi ordered his fleet to move with all haste. He would not let another Japanese slaughter go unanswered. When they reached the harbor city of Dongpo, he once again smashed through the enemy line with his turtle ship, positioned it right next to the enemy flagship, and buried shot after shot in its side. With his turtle ship in their midst, the enemy couldn't maneuver, and because the turtle ship had heavy guns on all sides, it couldn't be flanked. It simply loosed salvo after salvo at everything around it. And while the turtle ship caused chaos, the rest of the Korean ships surrounded the Japanese and trapped them in the harbor. At the height of the battle, one of Yi Sun-shin's sub-commanders, Kwon-jun, stood upon the deck of his vessel, drew his bow, and loosed an arrow at the enemy admiral. The shot found its mark.
Ooh.
Two of his men then leapt upon the enemy flagship and cut off the Japanese admiral's head. Seeing their commander's head held aloft, the Japanese were thrown into a panic. Command broke down, and in the chaos, Yi's ships sank the Japanese vessels one by one. As night fell and the Koreans withdrew, not a single Japanese ship remained. 2 days later, another Korean fleet, a fleet that was supposed to have joined them before any of this began but ran behind, finally rendezvoused with Yi, bringing his squadron up to 51 ships in total. With this larger force, he began to chase down rumors of another anchored Japanese fleet sacking a Korean town. The rumor turned out to be true, and again, Yi pounced upon the Japanese while they were disorganized, plundering a town. Again, Yi sent his turtle ship into their midst, and again, he used a feigned retreat to lure them out into open water.
So, I'm hoping that we get to experience some sort of flaws in this turtle ship thing, because honestly, it feels kind of overpowered in this context. I'm kind of hoping, for the sake of story, I believe there's 2 to 3 more episodes of this series. For the sake of story, I'm kind of hoping that they end up finding a way to combat this turtle ship, because I feel like we're going to be having a lot of the same conflict over and over again when it comes to it. But it also highlights how incredibly impressive the engineering behind this thing is. It seems to be like completely impenetrable, and I guess the fact that it's new, I should expect it to work more effectively early on, because the Japanese don't really know what it is yet. They're still trying to figure out exactly how to combat it. So I'd imagine later in the conflict, they're going to be able to figure out some sort of approach, some sort of a weakness, something that can take this thing out.
Although this time he did it to keep the Japanese from fleeing to shore if they were defeated. Again they followed, and again, upon his signal, his fleet turned upon their pursuers. Again the Japanese admiral fell in the battle, and Japanese morale broke. Again, the Koreans trapped the fleeing vessels, and again, the Japanese fleet, 26 ships in all, was destroyed, without a single loss for Yi's forces. Turtle Ship was OP. Upon hearing of all this, Hideyoshi was furious. He was so close to conquering Korea. His men had taken Pyongyang. The Korean court had been driven all the way to a tiny border village. Any further and the King of Korea wouldn't even be on Korean soil anymore. There was only one province he had not yet been able to overrun, Chola, where Yi was based. And without control of the sea, he couldn't resupply his massive army in the field. Yi must be destroyed. The order was given. There would be no more land raids from his navy until Yi's fleet was at the bottom of the Tsushima Strait.
Okay, so at this point, I was wondering how the navy could even come into play at this point, but I overlooked like the possibility of supplies. Like, I was thinking, the land forces seem to be taking out the Koreans quite easily at this stage. How could Yi be the difference maker? But yeah, the navy is one of the biggest factors when it comes to intercepting supplies and stuff. So if he's able to hold off any supply chain, or cut off the supply chain, then yeah, that would very quickly turn the tides of the war. Okay, so that makes sense. Okay, I'm slow on military stuff, but I'm glad that I'm having it explained to me in a way that makes a ton of sense.
Ordered his admirals to pool their forces and to form a massive fleet to sweep aside this admiral that was causing him so much pain. The three main Japanese admirals were to gather their fleets in Busan, but the admiral with the largest fleet, Wakisaka Yasuharu, decided that bringing the fleets together was taking too long. Side note, if you watched our Sengoku Jidai series, this is one of the men who would eventually betray Ishida at the Battle of Sekigahara. Anyway, eager for glory and unwilling to wait for the rest of the Japanese forces, he set out with his 73 ships. I mean, why wait? He had 73 of the best ships in the Japanese fleet, and he knew Yi's armada, however devastating they might have been so far, was a small force.
But they have like one turtle ship. Apparently that's all you really need. Since nobody's able to do anything about it,
But Yi hadn't been idle after his last battle. He'd been drilling his men in new tactics and constructing additional ships. With these new additions, his fleet now numbered 56, and most importantly, with 2 new turtle ships he could bring to bear. On July 7, 1592, a local farmer came to tell Yi that he had seen a huge Japanese armada, at least 70 ships strong, in the Kyonerang Strait. Yi had his fleet there by the next day. Knowing that he couldn't maneuver in the strait, Yi sent out 6 of his ships to lure the Japanese, and sure enough, the entire Japanese force followed at all haste. But this time, the Japanese faced yet another surprise. This technique of luring out the Japanese had been working so well that Yi had trained his men in a special formation called the Crane's Wing, where they would form a U around the enemy vessels that chased his ships, compressing them from all sides, making them easy targets, and leaving them no room to maneuver. The Crane's Wing descended. The sound of cannon fire ripped the air. One of the largest naval battles in world history raged for hours. But when the smoke cleared...
I'm laughing at the image of the turtle ship, not the complete devastation that's going on. Like, it's just so silly when you think about it. Just having that big dragon head sticking out of it. Like, I really appreciate it from a stylistic point of view. But if something about it just makes me laugh among everything. It feels utterly unserious, despite how serious things are.
One of the largest naval battles in world history raged for hours. But when the smoke cleared, 47 of the Japanese ships were sunk and 12 were captured. Only 14 of them escaped to the harbor at Busan. And still, Not a single Korean ship was lost. The next day, Yi was informed of the location of the other two admirals' fleets. They were anchored together at Ungulpo. Yi saw the opportunity for a decisive blow, and so he set his vessels fresh off the last battle towards another attack. This time, though, no matter what he tried, the Japanese refused to be lured out of their position. So Yi sent his ships in small assault squads, using their superior range to hammer the largest of the Japanese ships, then moving clear so another squad could circle in and fire. The battle was long and bloody. Though still none of Yi's ships were sunk, between the action outside of Kyonerang and the Battle of Ungulpo, hundreds of his sailors were wounded. It was the most damage the Japanese had done to Yi's fleet to date. But the...
You know what? This is something I pointed out in the previous ones, but this really is one of the most kind of seemingly formulaic stories that came from Extra History so far. It's just the material that they're working with. I'm not saying anything bad about the way they're presenting it, but there is a lot of repetition that goes on in the way Yi approaches things. He has a very formulaic way of approaching things. He has his go-to moves. He has his go-to ships. He's got his strategy kind of locked down at this stage, so I'm not surprised that we're getting a lot of battles that kind of work out the same way over and over again. And the Japanese, I'm really... At first, I was kind of rooting for Yi, but now I'm thinking, like, I want this to be a little more competitive, and I'm just thinking, like, oh, can't the Japanese figure out how to take down this turtle ship? That's the one. I understand that's not the only factor here. Like, that crane maneuver is... It sounds impressive from the looks of it, but, yeah.
The majority of the Japanese fleet in the harbor was destroyed. Only a few ships remained, and these Yi ordered not to be touched, because many of the Japanese soldiers had fled to the nearby shore, and, as he said, many brigands escaped into the mountains where local inhabitants have taken refuge. If all the Japanese ships were to be burned, the brigands would massacre Korean citizens in revenge. As he expected, instead of slaughtering the peasants in the hills, the Japanese boarded their remaining boats and slipped away in the night. 6 days later, upon hearing the news of these calamitous defeats, Hideyoshi ordered all offensive naval operations to cease. From now on, the Japanese Navy would only guard the passage to Busan. And so, with one stroke, Yi destroyed all of Hideyoshi's hopes for invading China. And without being able to resupply from the sea, even the Japanese efforts on the Korean peninsula were in jeopardy. The supply lines to the forces occupying Pyongyang were sorely stretched, and pursuing the Korean court any further became effectively impossible. Though the Korean army had been beaten on land time and time again, Yi had saved Korea. But the war wasn't over. Join us next time for Yi's attempt to land a finishing blow, treachery, and perhaps the greatest last stand in naval history.
Oh, are there only 4 of these? I haven't actually checked to see how many episodes of this series are. Maybe I shouldn't check, just so I can feel like maybe next time could be the last one. Having that suspense there might be better than knowing for a fact how it would end. I don't know. This one was really cool. I do clearly have a little bit of trouble connecting to naval warfare. Like, that's definitely clear. I'm sure I've demonstrated that big time in this video. Like, while I'm trying, it's not very easy for me, even when it's explained in very simple terms. But overall, I still think this is really cool. And Yi is still quite the enigma right now. I'm very fascinated with his power. I'm very fascinated with his intellect, but I'm still not connecting with him like as a human being on the same level that I have with figures in previous Extra History series. That's kind of the one thing that I'm not getting here. I feel like there's so much distance between me and Admiral Yi the person. Like, I'm getting to know Admiral Yi the leader, but I feel like I have no idea who this guy is, despite knowing what he's done. But I'm curious to see how this goes. There are little moments of character that kind of come out in here, but they're all so just badass. You never get to see him like vulnerable, which is fine. If that's how he is, that's how he is. But I'm not sure what to do with it, honestly, in my head. I'm just not sure how to handle it. But I'm excited to see where this series goes. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what extra history series you want me to check out next. I have a few in mind, but I would love to hear what you guys have to say. Thanks for watching, and I will see you tomorrow with another video. All right.